Welcome back to the TELSIC podcast. No, I'm not Phil. This is Deanne, but don't worry, he will be joining us today. We're just switching up our roles a bit this round. We're joined today by Kelly Webb-Davies, a familiar contributor to Lead TELSIC over the years. Kelly's focus is on thoughtful integration of AI with a social justice lens. She joins us to talk about bias in academic English language expectations, expanding opportunities for communication across world Englishes, and improving access to knowledge for those facing barriers due to language, accent, or neurodivergence. And of course, AI has a role. We discuss the convergence of these modern topics in EAP and explore the discussion through multiple lenses, with an eye to the benefits and limitations of different approaches. For those of you who are new to the podcast and don't yet know Phil, he is the originator of the TELSIC podcast. He is a lecturer and program leader at the University of York's International Pathway College. He is currently designing and teaching their new EAP module on AI literacy. I am Deanne Kobzagadlo, Phil's co-coordinator for events with Lead TELSIC, and I am an EAP teaching fellow at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Kelly starts off this episode by telling us about her new position with the AI Competency Center.
So I made this kind of accidental shift into being a business technologist. So I work for the AI Competency Center in Oxford, which has been around for about a year. And when they were set up, they kind of created this term. I'm sure a business technologist also exists, but it's not very common. So when we introduce ourselves, we say business technologist, which basically means AI consultant. So it was from my work with, trying to address this issue of generative AI in EAP that I saw the job came up and took my chance and applied for it. And that's how I've ended up there. So we have 3 business technologists in the center, and we have worked out we kind of have different specializations, and mine's ended up being education.
All right. Well, it was really nice to see both of you again, Kelly. I thought it was longer than it was since we did the webinar. I was prepared to look at the timestamp and see that it was 4 years ago, but it was early last year. So, Deanne, how's your translanguaging? How confident are you?
In terms of understanding a little bit more about translanguaging in the field, I'm understanding a lot more, and that thanks largely to your introduction, Kelly, in your webinar. So I guess what we should probably start with is just asking you to maybe define for our new listeners, those that didn't attend your webinar, what is translanguaging and where does it fit into the world of EAP?
Yeah, first I want to be clear that I wouldn't even consider myself an expert in translanguaging, but overall it is basically just the fundamental definition of it, which is generally people who are multilingual using all of the linguistic tools in their repertoire to create meaning. That's the general definition that's given. And this, of course, has a lot of influence in pedagogy, how we teach people language and how education itself works, but also socially and politically as well. It's something that people should, I think, consider more than they probably do. And there's this general idea through education that you have a language and another language and they're separate entities, or a register of a language and that's separate from a different language. But that's really not how people and how languaging works, because people mix these things together. It's a lot more complicated than education leads us to believe when we're taught, in primary school, secondary school. You have good English. You have to learn good English so that people will value your ideas. And if you don't express your ideas in that way, then they're not valuable. People will judge them. So yeah, I think a lot of my ideas are based on maybe in a very quite basic understanding of translanguaging, not getting into like the nitty gritty of the concept itself, because there are different applications of it. There are different versions, like strong versus weak. But I don't even think that's necessary to understand the things that I'm talking about. It's just very basically, fundamentally, how do people language? And it's different to what we're taught in school. I mean, you go through education, like I said, what's good English? How are you supposed to express your ideas? And if you're someone like me who went into like undergraduate linguistics, I went into it not even knowing what linguistics was. I think it's like very first class that you get into undergrad linguistics 101 is all languages are legitimate and valuable and have the potential to be equally as expressive and descriptive. And so you have to then unlearn all of that stuff you learned about what language is and what it means.
Listening again, going back to your talk, that you you focused a lot on academic English there, and is academic English and this kind of trying to move the focus away from the kind of register that we teach, is that one of the primary concerns of translanguaging, that, or is it a lot broader than that, and that's just something that you chose to focus on in your talk?
I think it's broader than that. I was focusing on it because I was teaching academic English, and it is, and I was struggling with that myself, teaching it and being someone who believed it was a gatekeeping device that kept people out of academia and professional spaces as well. And so eventually I came up with this kind of metaphor to kind of explain it to myself, like what was I doing, what was my goal. And I thought to myself of academia, even professional spaces, as this building with locked doors. And the key to get in those locked doors is academic English. You have to be able to have this skill to get in. And so what I was doing was helping my students learn how to cut those keys they needed to get into the building. And then to maybe torch the metaphor a little bit more, when ChatGPT came along, I'm like, well, how does this fit into everything? And I thought, well, it's kind of an automatic key cutting machine. You still have to know how to use it. You still have to have some skill to use it. Or maybe it's a lockpicking machine, a lockpick, if you're using it, and not telling people you're using it. But how fair is that? That people have some help getting in to the locked doors. So yeah, I think. So for me, academic English, not academic English itself, but the expectation, but that's the only way you can present legitimate ideas. Otherwise, they're going to be judged, which definitely happens. I think that's the problem, and that's the thing that I think that language technology can help people with, and it should be a legitimate help, a legitimate part of the writing process, but it's not, because it's seen that you're not able to express intellectual ideas in the way that people value, in the way that makes them sound intellectual. But then I want people to reconsider why do they have to be expressed in that way for them to be considered worthy? Why can't they be expressed in other ways? In my workshops in Oxford and my external talks as well, I use a lot, I think I used it in the webinar I did for TELSEC as well, a paragraph from Vishwana Shanti-Young's article, which is the entire article published in an academic journal, is written in African American English. And I always ask people, like, can academic writing look like this and still be academic? And the range of responses I get is just really interesting.
So the way that I've kind of seen translanguaging and how this into this EMI, EAP world is that it's just one aspect of the post-colonialization of EAP, in that we're trying to break that hegemony of being, these colonial powers, are going out, and instead of physically colonized country, we're instead intellectually colonizing countries. And I think in my context, in Kazakhstan, this is something always forefront in my mind. Am I presenting ideas such that I am forcing Westernization, perhaps, upon my students? Or am I giving them enough space to come and bring their own ideas? Translanguaging is one aspect of this, in terms of creating that space, that third space for learning that these students need, where we kind of come together, and it's neither mine nor theirs, and we need to kind of work together. And I was just wondering, you mentioned about AIs, and I wondered how that then fits into this idea of this shared culture, because AI as an engine doesn't really have a culture, but it does have a cultural bias.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that's one of the concerns that comes up in translanguaging and the use of AI, or?
Well, definitely in the use of AI, and that's definitely correct. So I think there is a risk. One of the biggest risks of this approach is that it just perpetuates standard language. And because these large language models are trained on trillions of examples of standard English, and that's why they're really good at standard English. So the risk is that if we continue to expect that ideas are expressed in this way, it perpetuates that. But to be honest, we're doing that anyway. In education and professional spaces, you are expected to write in a certain way. But I think also, if we accept that it's a tool that can allow people to enter these spaces, which are otherwise they get kept out of, then it can be used to disrupt the status quo. And that's I think where it kind of fits in. But it does require this rethink of how people are languaging, what's legitimate. And my approach to it is that I think if we in education not even allowed, but empowered students to use whatever languaging, and I don't even mean just in terms of a different language, I mean in terms of a different register of language or a different mode of language to do their thinking and all the intellectual work of argumentation and brainstorming, figure out their ideas, and explicitly say to them, you don't need to do this part in academic English. All of that part is bringing their own identity in, bringing their own thinking in, and showing that we value that type of languaging as well. It's kind of giving it a back door into education, because students do feel the way that they go through the education system, they do get made to feel inferior about if their languaging isn't the standard type. My ideas aren't good because I can't express it in this way. And that's just not true. And we don't teach them that. I've been looking through some, policy documents for schools recently for something else I was doing. And they're getting better. So there is a lot, students have to be able to speak, express themselves, standard English, full sentences, all that kind of business. Some of them, that's getting less so. It's more about communication. Can they communicate clearly? But there's still no outward requirement for them to bringing in those other types of languaging, different the different varieties of English, different registers. Isn't explicit in the guidance. That's not a learning outcome at all. And also, I think where I take the translanguaging idea a little bit further than it otherwise exists is it is often English and Welsh or English and Spanish, two different languages, bringing them both in. But I think it applies also to different registers of language. Language is not, categorizing languages is often a socio-political act. What is English, what is Spanish? But it applies to, language is a continuum. You've got this type of English, you've got another type of English. There's a continuum of how they're different. So I think that translanguaging can also be applied to the different varieties of English. So maybe in, urban London, multicultural London English, we could be empowering students to do their academic work and their thinking in that and giving it a back door, legitimizing it. And so then the students who are given that chance might be more likely in the future to go on to be the people to be I could be doing this professional work in standard English, but maybe I want to show my identity and I want to write this in a different type of English, and it not be, at the moment, the only space for that is in creative writing. Maybe, that's the only place we will allow that to happen. But maybe it could come in we could be more imaginative about the way that we allow students to use, or just people, that we allow people to use language in professional and academic spaces.
I was going to ask about academic English. And before I do, I'm getting a lot of flashbacks to world Englishes. Is translanguaging like an evolution as a movement from, because I remember reading a lot about world Englishes before, going back 15, 20 years or so. So this is before even machine translation came in, before the technological aspect kind of took a lead on it. So is there a lineage here between translanguaging and world Englishes and the circles of English and varieties?
It's probably not a straight line, but I think they definitely intersect with each other. So translanguaging itself was developed in the 90s in Wales, Ken Williams, that when they were bringing in more Welsh medium education. So it came from that, and that itself was a political and social issue of giving Welsh more space in formal context to legitimize it. But yeah, definitely, I think it's not even just world Englishes. That again, world Englishes is just the variety of different languages, of different forms of English that exist, and that doesn't just apply to different countries. It applies just within the UK itself. There are varieties of English within the UK which are stigmatized. Like I said, multicultural London English. I always bring up during this, I think I did during the webinar as well, is Big Manny, who is a Black Londoner who does chemistry demonstrations. He started off on TikTok, I think, in this multicultural London English. And you get a lot of people in his replies, young people saying, oh, if you had explained this to me in this way, I would have learned it so much better in school. But But also I think we're just not imaginative enough about the ways that written language could be expressed, and that we can deal with it. So you get this argument that, writing has to be clear, it has to be accessible to everyone. Yeah, a lot of people have to be able to understand it. But I'm reading a couple of books at the moment. One I can't remember the name of because I've just started it, which has chapters written from a point of view of someone who's writing in Jamaican patois, Creole. And so I'm reading that. It's a little bit difficult for me, but I get used to it. And then I'm reading another one, I think it's by Colin Burnett, called The Working Class State of Mind, which is written in a version of Scots. I think it might not be pure Scots because I can understand it fairly well. But again, writing can exist in these ways. And again, World Englishes, this is one thing I really struggled with when I was teaching EAP, where I really started to try and work out where I stood and what I was doing, was that, especially when I started teaching a lot of Nigerian students. So one of the things I would do first when I got a new class is I would always ask them, what languages do you speak that are not English? Because I wanted to find out, and also I love talking about language. And a couple of times I had students who just said English, and they were Nigerian students. And eventually, it should have dawned on me earlier, but it dawned on me at that point, of course, they speak English. That's their first language. It's just not the right type of English. And then they have to pay these extra thousands, probably tens of thousands of pounds to come and do this course because it's not the right type of English. When, a lot of the time they're very insightful, very intelligent students, otherwise they wouldn't be there in the first place. But they have this extra burden. So yeah, it's World Englishes, but it's all the varieties of different stigmatized Englishes, and who counts as having correct English, who counts as having legitimate English. A lot of the time it ends up being people from the UK or the US or Australia. But even in all of those places, English was a language which was a language of immigrants who came in, colonizers who came in to the countries. Even in the UK, hundreds of years ago. It wasn't, the Celtic languages, British languages. English came from across the sea.
Yeah. So with the point, you touched on it just there with the idea of plain language. I mean, we deal with EAP, so we're talking about English, but really we could just say communication generally. And communication, simple, clear communication is an art form in itself. And watching your video again last year, which by the way I'll link to in the show notes here so people can check it out. And that demo you mentioned was great because there was someone in a Londoner and in a sort of local vernacular just kind of explaining something really clearly, and it was fantastic. And there's loads more examples I can think of. Is that an argument though for just honing the art of communication generally? And because I think what that guy was doing in your demo was beyond, it wasn't just using the vernacular. It was someone who really had like a proper understanding of what it was they were trying to explain, and was able to demonstrate that understanding themselves by putting it into a simple vernacular or just simple language that everyone can understand, and making that accessible. And it's kind of like, it reminds me a bit of like the argument Steve Pinker was making back in 2017 when he came out with A Sense of Style. He was just did this massive takedown of academic language and how it was just, in many ways serving no purpose other than to kind of like be an exclusive little club. And I know there are counter arguments to that, and we can talk about.
I mean, I think one thing is like precision is important. So that's one of the benefits of like what we describe as academic English, but precision can exist in other forms of English, all of them. But also I think the other thing to think about is you talk about a language that is clear a lot, but then you have to ask clear for who. And I like a lot of influence on my thinking of this was someone called Vijay Ramjatan. I don't know I'm sorry if I probably butchered his name, but he talks a lot about the white listener. So this is like directed at the white listener. It's clear for, where does this language come from? Of course, not only white people use academic English, but where did the language come from? It came from people who were in power, people who were people of privilege and people of status. And the example I give a lot in my talks is that this idea of linguistics distance from academic English. So if you were born to a fairly wealthy family in southern England, then your English is already fairly similar to academic English. You don't have as big a distance to cross to learn academic English. And then you've got to think, so if something is clear, because it's written in academic English, it's clear for the people who already find that type of language accessible. And I did this once a couple of times. I used to do this with my students when I was teaching EAP. I asked them at one point, I had a Menti poll, which was, is standard/academic English better than other types of English? And I just got their ideas. And most of them said, yes, it is. And then I asked them to write down why. And a lot of them were saying because it's clearer, because it's easier to understand, because blah, blah, blah. And then I would put up a paragraph from an academic article and say to them, is this easy for you to understand? And they'd be like, no. I'm like, so clarity, there's a quote from Julia Molinari's book, which is, clarity is in the eye of the beholder, in the ear of the beholder, I guess, if you're talking about speaking. So you've got to consider not only, clarity, but clarity for who? Who is this understandable for? Who are we directing it at all the time? How does that play into power and status and prestige?
Because it's important to remember as well that like, academic English, almost by definition, does not mean that it's necessarily clear. For
a lot of the time.
If you're lucky enough to have English as a first language and you're in academia, then you have one fewer hurdle to jump across. But I think the example that was often touted was Judith Butler's writing. I don't know if anyone's ever had the pleasure of marking an essay where there is a card. So it's playing to a very specific audience, and to me, I'm a native speaker of English. It was absolutely meaningless to me. One of the things I read it several times. I have no idea what she's arguing. So anyone who's not familiar with Judith Butler, she's she was at least really big in the 90s. I'm not sure what she's up to now, but she wrote a lot about gender ideology. And I was working with people from the humanities and somehow ended up second marking some essays of theirs, which is probably a recipe for disaster. And so I had to go back and read Judith Butler's works, which I hadn't grown up with academically at all. And to me, it was just everything you're talking about. It was someone who was just had mastered this patter and was using it to promote these ideas that only a select few people could understand. So when you say like clear for who, there are a group of people for whom this was completely clear. And my colleagues who set the essays, and to them it was like this was the most enlightening thing they'd ever read, and it was fantastic, and it struck a chord with them, and it changed their outlook on life and gender and everything else. But it wasn't something that was divided neatly down like English as an L1 or other, because there were people who, it was kind of a mindset as well. But yeah, it was what Steve Pinker called, because he used this as an example in his book, and he had this great line. He said, in reality, academics can effortlessly dispense this kind of sludge. It looks intimidating, but it doesn't actually take any talent to write. And that was the bit that really I was like, so when I teach my students, I'm always like, it's important to be able to read academic English and unpack it, but when you're writing, please make it accessible to everyone.
I did this in a keynote last week. Actually, I had a slide which said, put your hand up if you've ever received an essay which was linguistically kind of perfect, linguistically really well articulated, but intellectually shallow. Everyone puts their, bunch of people put their hands up. And then I say, because this is about, generative AI, and I say, keep your hand up if this also happened before 2022. And yes, people here keep their hands up. But also I think it's people are recognizing this problem, because I see plain language summaries. Have you seen these in academic articles? Certain journals do them. So you'll have an abstract, and then you'll have a plain language summary as well, which is basically just an accessible version of the abstract that everyone can understand. I'm like, well, why not just have that? So people can understand it. And also Tatsuya Amano, who works at the University of Queensland, who was, I think, a climate environmental scientist. But he's got some work on making academic language or academia accessible for people in terms of multilingual accessibility. And they held a conference in the last year where they used language technology. They used, I can't remember what it's called now, but it was basically simultaneous translation software. So everyone who went to the conference could choose what language they presented in. So, people who didn't speak English as their first language could choose to do their presentation in whatever language, feel more confident doing it, their own kind of identity and their own kind of languaging. And then I think everyone in the audience could select on their phones what simultaneous translation they wanted so they could understand it. So then it was like, this the advances in language technology making this accessible for everyone. If we just accept, that's a tool that we can use, that expecting everyone to have to do it in academic English is not necessarily the way forward. It doesn't help everyone to be able to express their ideas or develop their ideas. I think could be a way forward in addressing an issue that we haven't had to address, but we have to now because, ChatGPT can just create a soulless essay in perfect language. So I think the language shouldn't be the issue. It's how do we get students or people to develop their thinking and their argumentation and their reasoning skills, and it not necessarily having to be in academic English, but then the technology can help them express that in a way that is accepted. So one thing that really helped me conceptualize this happened in a moment when I was discussing with my academic director in my last job. We were having a discussion about ChatGPT and bringing in and generative AI and bringing it into classrooms and skills. What skills did students need? And I was kind of of the opinion that writing skills are a little bit less important than they were. Not that they're not important, but a little bit less. And so she brought up the calculator argument. So we've got engineers, we've got physics students, we have calculators, but they still need to know the maths to be able to do what they're doing. And I said to her, well, yeah, but our students don't come to us without language. They have language, they have ideas. It's just not academic English, and that's what they have to learn. So, and that kind of, even for me, that was a moment of, oh yeah, it's not that they're unintelligent, they don't have ideas, and of course they do. They have language. It's just not the right type of language.
I'm going to throw this out there, Kelly, and I'm asking this because there will probably be someone out there who is very against the idea, perhaps. Every once in a while, I do come across somebody in the EAP world whose response to the idea of translanguaging is that this is a woke mentality. That they say it as a very, kind of, I'm just going to disregard it completely. And so when you do come across someone that has this kind of approach or ideology around it, how would you respond to them in kind of explaining it?
I would say, first of all, it is woke, and I refuse to submit to this definition of woke that means bad. I'm like, woke means informed. So yes, it is, and that's a good thing. It means that you're aware of not just the issues of people with status or prestige, but you're empathizing with people who are marginalized, and that's exactly. The other thing I say is that I get so much less pushback on these ideas than I expect to. I feel like they're maybe a bit less left field. The workshops I do in Oxford are basically going into rooms full of teaching staff, professors at Oxford, and being like, I know you're all worried about ChatGPT and generative AI and education, but these are the reasons why it's a language issue. This is why detection is not really the way to go. And this is why it's actually a legitimate part of the writing process and can enable accessibility, not just for people who have, marginalized languaging, but people who are neurodiverse. I have ADHD. It's an enormous help for me when I'm in my writing process now, because I can allow my writing process now to be verbal as well. And that's how I think best. And just showing the ways that it can enable intellectual processes, not take them away, as long as you're addressing it the right way, with students. But yeah, how would I address it with them? It's kind of just trying to get people to, again, unlearn this idea that standard and academic English is the only way that you can express legitimate ideas. And that's a big thing, like even for people who are professors at Oxford, because you've gone through your entire schooling from like primary school to high school to undergraduate to postgraduate of people saying, I'm going to judge you on your language, and if you don't express things this certain way, then it's not legitimate ideas and you sound uneducated. And I think everyone's aware of that to a certain extent, unless you are someone who was exclusively brought up with that type of English. Maybe you went to Eton. So I think everyone can sympathize and identify with that to a certain degree. And I think I also I give everyone kind of a mini linguistics 101 lecture to be like, all languages are legitimate. This is what you learn when you start linguistics. You will need to know it as well. But also in that using generative AI in the way that I do in my writing process is letting go of that idea of academic English being the only way you can express and develop ideas is actually really useful, because now if I let go of the fact, it's still in there, even for me, like a linguist, I have all these ideas. I know other ways of languaging are legitimate, but still, even now when I'm doing speech to text, sometimes I will be trying to phrase something academically to try and get the idea out. And then I go, wait a minute, I don't even need to say it that way. It doesn't need to be like this sort of grammatically, I don't even want to say perfect, because I'm doing speech is different to writing. I can put in my little hesitations. I can put in my repetition, or I can say thingy if I want to, instead of, I can't even think of the academic word for that now. But that's kind of the affordance of generative AI. It can take this type of like messy, informal language and help you make it something which is academic and standard, but accepting that you doing that doesn't make you unintelligent. People kind of, education builds into people this inferiority with their languaging, because if you try to language in a certain way and someone comes up to you and puts a big red X next to it and says, no, that's not correct, that's not good English, it doesn't sound intelligent, doesn't sound educated, of course people internalize that. And unlearning that is a really, really big thing. But I think it applies to most people.
Is that maybe the crux of it, though? We hear these stories of graduate students experiencing horrible experiences in graduate school with their supervisor saying, well, that's what graduate school is. That's what it was like for me as well. And is that maybe a bit of what is happening as well with English and academic English, that there's a layer of people who believe, well, we had to do it. We had to put in the work. We had to learn to write like this. So therefore you must. And, this perpetuation of this behavior as a result. Is that what you're trying to say? And
yeah, I think this comes down to the phrase which I hear in all the time in all of the generative AI education spaces, which is writing is thinking. This is why it's important, why we need to get students to do this and without generative AI, because writing is thinking. And I always bristle at that, and I'm getting more and more annoyed at it, because I'm thinking writing can be thinking. It can be really important in the thinking process for a lot of people, but in different ways. But writing is language technology. It always has been. And it changes, the technology develops, our processes change with it. And also, as a form of language technology, it's languaging. Speech is languaging, signing is language. So that is also thinking. And we've kind of, writing has been so centered in education and professional spaces for good reason, because it was the only way we had to record and transmit information across space and time. So it was an important skill that you had to learn, because otherwise you couldn't practice in these spaces. But now that's just not the case anymore. We need to catch up with the technological developments which allow us, record audio, we can record video of speech. And so for other people, different parts of the writing process can be important for people with their thinking. I find that the kind of, maybe not even brainstorming, but the structuring part of the process is really useful for me in terms of thinking and getting my ideas together. And often I will get a Padlet and I will put posts in with the different points I want to make, and then I'll move them around physically. But there are a lot of different ways to do it and this is something I address especially when I've got educators who are maybe writing instructors and that sort of thing. I'm like, you probably have this idea that writing is thinking because it helped you, and just through the process of gatekeeping, it got you to your position. So this kind of selection bias, confirmation bias, that it is the way to think because it helped me personally to think, this is how I do it. There's not the case for everyone. I've been in academia since my undergrad 20 years ago, yeah. And I think by now, if writing was the thing that helped me to think, and it just turns out I'm just not good at it, then I wouldn't have the ideas that I have now. And especially since my ADHD diagnosis, I've really come to accept, maybe that just doesn't work for me. Maybe I do work better verbally, my internal monologue, running and running and running, and thinking, actually, no, that is a benefit for me if I embrace that and I allow myself to think that way. But again, thinking to myself, there's probably students that this works for as well, and it's important to consider. I think part of progress is considering, being progressive, that these things are changing, is that not only is the technology changing, we need to keep up with that, but that we can bring more people in that previously were gate kept out. So I often think to myself, like, imagine all of these people that we missed out on in academia and in the world because just writing wasn't their forte. It wasn't the way that helped them to think, that there are other ways to think. And if we enable that, then that could be a net positive for the world.
So just a couple of points on that. I think going back to the idea of gatekeeping, is some of the idea of what you're saying shifting the onus from the writer or speaker to the reader or listener? So let's say we have we want to just give everyone a voice, and we're disregarding the idea of academic English. And by the way, just to add, I think this idea of, if anyone's actually teaching academic English in the sense that, your job here is just to dress everything up, dress your ideas up in this like abstruse prose that is incomprehensible to anyone outside the academy, I think that's just crappy teaching generally. And I hope that we've moved on. I'd hope that's not a widespread thing, and we are more about trying to teach people to communicate. But with what you're saying there, are you shifting the onus from the producer of language to the recipients? And yes, we've kind of given voice to a lot more people because they can use whatever medium or register or language. The options are wider for them. But does that not then put a strain or an onus on the listener to either they've got to then untangle what someone has said, either because they've spoken perhaps more of a stream of consciousness than a structured piece of writing that we traditionally suggest, or they've had to mediate their understanding through technology because someone's using a vernacular or a language that is foreign to them. Yeah, I guess that's an objection that I can see. You've given power to the language producer, but at the expense of, so you're just kind of like excluding different people, are you not? Or making them use tech?
Yeah, but I think that exclusion is maybe balancing as well. Because again, I say this in my talks, I'm like, so that paragraph I use of the African American English from that journal article, I'm like, yeah, this is like harder for me to read than probably something that's written in academic English, depending on if someone's written clearly or not. But why shouldn't I have to go to some of the effort as someone who's a wealthy white woman who speaks a fairly standard form of English as well? It is putting the onus on someone else, but I think that's being progressive. That is balancing things a little bit while keeping in mind that our students do go off into a world where not everyone thinks like this. So I think some of the pushback that I get from people who are often linguists and people who are interested in linguistic justice is that we shouldn't be, the focus still shouldn't be on standard academic English, and by using ChatGPT to make writing like that, we're just perpetuating that, like I said earlier. But again, I try and come at this from not too much of an idealistic approach, but a realistic one as well, in that it is, like I said, it's good to empower students in their languaging and teach them by including it in classes that it's all legitimate and that their identities are important as well, and that we value their ideas no matter kind of how they're expressed. But that we also recognize they're going to go off into a world where there are social norms surrounding language and how they're supposed to express things, and they also need to know that. So there's a quote I heard on a linguistics podcast called because language, which was, and it was from someone who was a teacher, which was teach the game, but call out the game. And that's what I was doing in my kind of last terms of teaching EAP a few years ago, which was I decided to make the topic of my entire term I wanted to choose a topic where my students could have ideas and opinions without necessarily having done any reading, because I was trying to get out of them, not correct answers, but what do you think and why do you think it? Because they were kind of falling down the argumentation. So I made the topic of the entire term like critical language awareness. And so we covered this. I was teaching them academic English, but during it, I was giving them videos and texts about, what is standard language ideology, what is, why are certain forms of language valued above other ones, and reflect on that yourself with your own languaging.
On that, are you seeing this, the responses that we've seen to AI with a greater shift towards different types of assessments? So we're coming across podcasts, video blogs, oral assessments. Is this something that, and obviously, with the essay being as susceptible as it is to validity concerns, is this something that I guess this is a movement that translanguaging would kind of endorse?
I think it would be. I was saying to Deanne before we got on that just by coincidence, I happened to see that Ophelia Garcia was doing a webinar last night. And with the time difference, it was like midnight last night. So it's the first time I've seen her speak. But I joined that last night. And right towards the end, I was really glad to see her mention that multimodality was an important aspect of this. So translanguaging not only in the different types of language, written language, but also in the modes of language. And also, so I really tried to pivot in my teaching to including more speaking practice and prioritizing speaking more than writing. And I saw this as a net benefit as well of ChatGPT coming in. I thought to myself, ChatGPT was released, EAP, okay, let's consider this. Usually writing has been like the priority in the terms of the 4 skills in EAP. It's writing. And I thought to myself, I think that's kind of dropped to the bottom. It's not important anymore, but there's these digital tools that can help you with it a lot. You still need skills to be able to use them. You need writing skills to be able to use them, and reading skills. But like speaking still needs to be spontaneous. It kind of always, the technology is improving, so maybe this won't remain as true, but I think it will for the most part. Needs to be spontaneous. And our students generally don't get enough practice doing it in class, because writing is often a very solitary exercise. Even when you try to do it in group, the students still need to speak to each other. And we also, in terms of assessment, we are a lot more accepting of linguistic diversity in speaking than we are in writing, to a huge extent. So students can have different accents, they can kind of stumble, they can use different grammar. I think we're a lot more accepting of that and willing to adjust to it as well as a listener. So you're saying, is some of the onus on the reader, is some of the onus on the listener? Yeah, and I think to myself, we kind of do that fine in listening. We adjust really quickly. Our brains are very good at that. Even as monolinguals, if we hear people speaking different types of English, even if the accent might be a bit hard at first, our brains just adjust very quickly. And I think the only reason that's not the case for writing is that we're just not exposed to it. It's an issue of exposure, because all writing is done basically, 99.9% of it is done in standard English, and that's all we're exposed to. And if we see anything that deviates from that, we think, oh, this is not legitimate, this is not educated or formal. But this is why I've been pushing myself recently to read more books that are written in unstandardized English, and I start reading them. They're difficult at first, but I adjust to them. So I think it's just an issue of opening up our ideas of what legitimate languaging is and being more creative with it, because so much of academia is centered on writing. But that's, if the assessments can change to being about speaking, then the teaching can change to be about speaking. And you can do what I try and do in my workshops at Oxford as well, is kind of separate academic function from form. So that paragraph I shown, African American English, I point out this in function, this is academic, because he's creating an argument, he's responding to someone critically, he's giving evidence for it. It's just in a different form than you would expect. And so getting people themselves to separate that when they've gone through all of this education for decades, to be like, this one type of language is both in function and form, is academic, and that's how it has to be. But if you separate those, then you can accept things that are in spoken language as well, and accept that they're still ideas. And I would do this with in my classes, when I did this, I put more of a focus on speaking. I would do things like academic reading circles. And I did one once where I gave different students different journal articles. They went away to read them. They came back together. And then I said to them, okay, so you have to tell each other about what you read. But when you do, I want you to explicitly mention the author of the person. So, in this thing I read, David Crystal said blah, 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 blah. And I said to them, so when you're doing that, why do I want you to do that? What are you doing when you do that? And they eventually went, oh, I'm citing. I'm like, yeah. So it's telling you what the purpose of citing is, rather than just you put citation in because it's a thing in brackets that makes it look academic, which is more of a surface level idea that students get to make things look academic, but actually getting them to do the function through speaking. You can do a lot of, I don't know, maybe I would argue all of academic function through speaking. You can create arguments, you can give evidence, you can brainstorm, all of this stuff you can go to do through speaking. And the technology exists now to allow you to do that and record it and still have it there as something you can go back to. Or you can, I use it a lot now, in not only writing processes, but our entire team at the competency center, we have a workflow now where if we have quite a complex thing to kind of get together, we will use meeting transcripts to do so. So we were developing a new website and we're like, what things do we want to put on the website? We've got all these ideas, but we need to structure them somehow. I guess in the past we could have gone off and written our own notes and bring them together and talked about them and tried to put them together. But what we did is we split off into groups and we just set record, like a transcribe on a laptop, and we just discussed in this kind of flow, this dialogue, just bouncing off each other. And then having just that would be very difficult to deal with because it's unstructured. Spoken language is a bit messy. But if you put that into generative AI and say, structure this, give me some ideas from what we've said about what should be on our website, like what did we come to the conclusion? And it would do that. And so that takes away some of the cognitive load of having to make those decisions, but there is still skill involved in seeing that output and going, yeah, that's good. No, I don't want to keep that. You're still making decisions that still requires skill to deal with it in that way. So I think, yeah, speaking is really important. I think it will become more important. I think that's a good thing overall.
I mean, we've been talking about translanguaging, we've been talking about basic English, we've been talking about dialectical English. And so this is the moments when my other languages start to come in, and I start thinking about it as a second language speaker in German. I obviously, I speak Hochdeutsch, very little slang, that tends to be what the second language speakers are trained to speak. And, found myself living and working in small town Germany, and all of a sudden there's the regional German that didn't understand it when spoken, and their local newspaper, they could not read a local newspaper due to the local writing style and such. And it strikes me is that if we are going to then ask our students, who are themselves second language speakers, to try and read not only academic English, which is kind of the standard high English, I guess, for academia, then are we actually making it harder on them? And I know AI might be the answer to this, but I'm just trying to imagine if I tried to read a paper written in Scouse, I don't think I could do it. It's just not a regional English that I can handle. And so I think if I, as a native speaker, would struggle with that, is that really, to open that area up too far? Is that unfair, then even more unfair to our second language speakers than asking them to meet a norm that has existed for some time?
Yeah, possibly. It would be like a big change, and I don't think society is going to flip all the way to, allowing every single variety of English to be written in, whatever dialects. I think we can push more towards that, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. But also, it's just kind of, for a certain part, it's an extension of an issue that already exists, which is when people are being employed as English teachers, people, there's this issue of whether you're a native speaker or not and what accent you have, and where people choose to go and speak English. So if you choose to go to a university in Edinburgh and do EAP and your tutor has a Scottish accent, that's a lot of the time that's not the ideal accent. Or if you go to Liverpool to learn English and your tutor has a Scouse accent, we're getting away from the to a certain extent, we're getting away from this idea that people have to be a speaker of standard or prestige varieties, and the more progressive, circles of EAP are accepting of that. Your teacher and might not speak the way you expect, and are you? What are you learning from that? So again, students do have to deal with that already in speaking, and in writing. It may be something they're going to maybe have to deal with more as well. But it's not only our students as well. It'll be people who are native speakers not having to not only just reading standard English, but also other varieties. So it's kind of everyone. But again, I think to it myself as I think we can deal with it better than we think we can. There might be a lot to learn. Might be more to learn, but thinking of the benefits you get out of that. So in any other situation, if you were thinking, oh, I've learned, this much academic vocabulary and I need to learn more academic vocabulary, the more vocabulary I get, the better it is. I've got this exposure to this new world because I've got all of these new linguistic things I can use in my repertoire. Why can't that also apply to different like vocabulary from other varieties of English that you wouldn't usually learn? So I think it's also a question of how we value knowledge, which type of language is valued as something that is valuable to acquire when you're learning a language, and which types of languaging aren't valued. And that's not down to the language itself, that's down to how the groups who use those language are perceived. So if you have, say you've got if I was to try and learn French and read a book in French, and I thought, oh, I've learned this new vocabulary so I can learn French and I can understand it now, that would be, I think I get a lot more prestige from that than if I said to someone, oh, I'm reading this book in Scots and I'm learning Scots words. There's these value judgments put on language, and what is worthwhile to be learned and what isn't. So yeah, it isn't. I think one of the biggest arguments people give for standardization of language is it makes it easier for people to understand. It's standard. There's less to learn. I don't think that is the only aspect to look at. And also, again, like we were talking about earlier, why have we chosen that as the standard? We can't have other more stigmatized varieties of language be accepted and validated if they don't exist in writing and speech and society, if they're not, representation. You need representation of different languaging. And that happened, I think, also, you think about the news, BBC News in 50 years ago, there was a type of speech you had to use, a type of accent you had to use everywhere in the BBC News. Otherwise, it didn't sound. And now there's a lot of newscasters with more regional accents. It's more accepted. And everyone got used to that. One thing I've always thought to myself that I would quite like to happen, but probably never will, was that on the tube, the announcements on the tube, if each line could have a different type of English accent or even grammatically from the people who live traditionally on that line in the different tube announcements, so that there was more variety. But again, people who are tourists listening to that might make it difficult for them. But I think that would be a fun idea.
Yeah, the hour has just flown by, but I was going to try and squeeze one more question in. I mean, we've been talking a lot about, it seems like shifting the bar, really, whether from onus to language producer to onus of comprehension to language receiver. And, you've mentioned there a debate, which I think I've read several papers on. It's that, standards versus inclusivity. It's almost just, I've read papers where people kind of play essay ping pong with each other, and they're sort of talking past each other, but standards, but inclusivity. And it's kind of like, are we talking mainly about just adjusting where the bar is set? And I'm thinking the just to contextualize one of the debates I was watching on this, it was about journal submission guidelines, for example. So if you want to involve the academic be more inclusive, then move away from academese in that sense and relax your submission guidelines, to which the response was yes, but all the things that you just outlined, Kelly, standards, intelligibility, communication being lost. So they're both kind of valid arguments. We want to be inclusive, we want to be intelligible, we want to make sure we have precision in our language. So if you were to adjust, for example, journal submission guidelines, I know this is a massively sweeping question, but focusing on that, what would you be talking about just a shift in where the bar is set, or would there be what's a journal submission guidelines in terms of language production that you think would be like more inclusive and would work towards some of the goals that you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know about guidelines. So I think, like I said, some journals are doing this already with the plain language summaries. So that's a start. But you could also accept that the language used to write the plain language summary could be used throughout the entire journal article. Why not? I've also seen a journal article. Oh, I used this one in the webinar as well, which was Charity Hudley wrote an abstract in the African American English she would use while she was teaching a class. But I've also seen academics write on social media about how they've had reviews back in the past criticizing their language. So this is someone whose first language was Chinese, and she got feedback from the reviewer, which was, you have to change this, and it was all like language feedback. But all the things that she had said were definitely understandable. So yeah, maybe some of it comes down to like what reviewers are allowed to give feedback on, like, and how they do it. It should be on ideas, not necessarily language. I think it was Springer were implementing their own generative AI sort of writing assistant. So I think the question is, what do we want? If you're expecting everyone to do everything in standard English, then digital help should be allowed. If you want everyone to be writing in a way that shows their own voice, then you need to be more accepting that there's going to be variation, and accept that in writing as well. So this is something as well I always bring up in my talks, which is we often say writing instructors, people who are EAP or in universities, I don't want students to use ChatGPT because I want to hear their voice, and ChatGPT makes it to, takes that away. But I always say, but again, speaking of my Nigerian students, they had English, they could write in Nigerian English, and it would have showed me that would have been their voice, but I would have had to mark them down according to our marking criteria. And to a certain extent, academic English is meant to be formulaic. You have the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank. It's giving you actual, chunks that you're supposed to put into your writing. So it's a real balance between what do we want? Do we want formulaic writing so everyone can understand it? Do we want people to write in their voice so that the writing seems more like them? I think at the moment the balance is more towards we want it to be formulaic, but we're not really admitting to that. And if you want it to be more like their voice, then journal articles would have to be more accepting of linguistic variation in writing, and they can put that into their standards and explain why that's there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. It's always a pleasure to see you. Deanne, did I railroad any of your last comments you had on that?
No, not at all. I did come in there thinking, okay, well, rather than not sounding like we're in an echo chamber, I'm going to throw in a few, contrary opinions and just see what happens.
Oh, I didn't even get to. Yeah, I was going to do an in defense of writing thing. Yeah, maybe for another podcast.
Yeah.
Kelly, Deanne, always really nice to see you.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you.